Welcome to Blizzard Animation, the art of setting the scene.
Wow, happy BlizzCon, everyone. Welcome to the Blizzard Animation panel, the art of setting the scene. Today, we have the privilege of talking to you about Zero Hour, the latest Overwatch animated short for the Overwatch 2 announcement piece. What'd you guys think? All right. You know, when we talk about art at Blizzard, it's real easy to think about the amazing key art that, you were greeted by coming into BlizzCon today, or, some of the images for, some of the cinematics we produce, and you're not wrong. But story of franchise development as a department, which Blizzard Animation is just one small facet of, employs over 400 artists, technicians, production support, editors, directors, all who work in service of that art. And a lot of them work in very non-traditional, very highly technical mediums. And if you've ever been to one of our panels before, you're probably, you probably heard us talk a lot about what it takes to make some of that final imagery and what all the work that goes into an individual shot. But today we're going to be taking more of a deep dive into, not what it takes to go into just one shot, but a whole series of shots or a whole scene. But before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So I'm Kevin Vanderjagt. I am the senior producer on the Overwatch animated shorts. And with me today is Ben Dye, director for Zero Hour.
Hello, everybody.
Many, many, many other episodes. To his left, we have Steve Haskell. He is our rigging and simulation supervisor. And to his left, Hunter Grant, our animation supervisor.
Hello, BlizzCon.
Last but not least, and joining us for the very first time on this stage, is our senior layout artist, Ben Cunningham.
Hello, hello.
And if you don't know what a senior layout artist is, he is the glue that holds all of this together. So, now, as I mentioned, when we talk about an individual shot on one of our cinematics, it's very easy to think about and it's very easy to contextualize things in a very linear order. And, what you see here is kind of a representation of that conversation typically, where every department that's involved in a typical in-shot production, hands off in a very linear order, from modeling to rigging, handing their work to previs, previs before animation, having look development done before you start your final effects and your final lighting for the shot. And although this is, an easy way to contextualize things when you're talking about an individual shot, it's kind of an idealized, production workflow. And unfortunately, it's sort of a perfect world scenario. And we don't live in that world. Our production process typically looks a little more like this. Now, if you don't follow everything that's going on here, that's totally fine. But basically, it's the idea that our asset creation for characters and environments heavily overlaps with the animation, the previs process. And we build in that overlap with the back-end departments as well, like animation and effects and lighting, so those departments can give each other feedback and ask for corrections, ask for fixes and updates to the things that they're working on. And now, this isn't even really accurate either, because when you look at a typical Overwatch animated short production, our process tends to look a little more like this, with very heavy overlap of virtually every department that allows for downstream and upstream feedback across departments. And over the past 4 years, we have developed a lot of tools and best practices production-wise to sort of embrace this workflow and really use it to our advantage. Again, production is rarely a linear process, especially when you're dealing with hundreds of shots. But when you build a system that's flexible enough to absorb changes and really embrace this model, there's unforeseen advantages. And that's really what today's panel is going to focus on. But before we get into too much of that, and actually I want to back up too, because those of you who are production savvy probably realize there's a representative from a department that is not listed up here, and that would be the layout department. They are represented by those little blue arrows. They are the ones who, if a typical artist on a show touches a dozen or so shots, layout is the department that touches every single asset across every single part of the pipeline. They make it all work. They're the ones who make it go.
Ben color-coded his hair so it'd be easier to figure out where he lies in the production pipeline.
That is correct.
Details.
So, yeah.
I'm all about details.
Before we get into that, I just wanted to start asking a quick question to Ben Dai. Why this story?
Well, some of you might remember a couple years ago we started animated shorts initiative in Blizzard, and then the first animated short was starring Winston, and he sent out this recall message, hoping that his friends, Overwatch members will answer the call. And then that sort of kickstarted dozens of animated shorts starring heroes and villains in the Overwatch universe. And we used that to celebrate the launch of Overwatch 1. So now that, right now we're 2019, we're announcing Overwatch 2. So I thought maybe it's a good idea to use Winston's story, sort of tie that up, close out some of the story points, and really use that to celebrate the announcement for Overwatch 2.
Yeah, and we knew we wanted to open the story on, the team's first mission after the recall event. So we actually brought with us some early animatic footage from, why don't you tell us?
Well, just so you know, this is really early. It's actually a different version that you're actually seeing right now. So this is something that's sort of behind the scene. No one has seen this before outside of Blizzard. So you guys get the first glimpse of what didn't make it into the final product. When we first started making this animated short, we actually started at the end of 2017. So yes, it's been a long production cycle. We didn't know a whole lot. The only information we have is that it's going to happen in Paris. It's going to be an Omnic invasion by the Null Sector, and we're going to feature a bunch of Overwatch characters. And we knew that the way that Omnics are invading cities, they're using their spaceship, their command ships, right? Command ships, and then they'll airdrop their Omnics. So I thought maybe a cool idea if we have a giant Omnic command ship looming over the sky, so our heroes has to sort of, team up and take that ship down. So behind us is a version of our hero try to take down the ship. You see May using ice wall, and then that's the biggest ice wall she ever built. Winston jumps on top of it, and then carrying Tracer, and then eventually I think he throws her like a basketball, and then
fastball special. Yeah,
that's a fastball special. She blinks a couple times, and then she drops her a little gift, and that's how they take down the ship. It sounded really cool in my head. It sounded really cool when I pitched it to the team, but then once you started boarding and putting everything together, it lacks something. So we went back to the storyboard process, went back to the drawing board, and then during one of the meetings, someone mentioned like, hey, what if we put a big giant robot in this? Maybe he's stomping around the city, doing all sorts of damage to the hero team, and then that's how we came up with the giant robot idea.
Yeah, and if you've had a chance to check out the Overwatch 2 demo already, or you saw some of the gameplay footage in opening ceremonies, you might notice that the command ship features pretty prominently, and that's not a coincidence. A lot of those ideas that we had in the initial animatic made their way into the cinematic for the gameplay, and we don't like to leave a good idea on the table, so... but yeah, that's kind of where we were, Ben. You want to talk a little bit about how we ended up where we are?
Yeah. So now that we have this moment where, the team are coming back, we know that we have a big giant robot, and then we storyboarded this sequence where Genji shows up, and then Reinhardt, and then so on and so forth. All the members of the Overwatch team shows up to save the day. And that moment stayed pretty much the same all the way through the production, from storyboard to previs to animation to lighting. Every single step of the way, we tried to make that a little bit better, putting more emotion in there once we translate the 2D drawing to 3D. Animation does a wonderful job of, making sure that the action and the actings are true, and lighting just put the icing on the cake to make sure that everything looked great. This moment that, during our production, we do test screening. We show to, team, we show it to the executive team, and every time we show it, this moment always got the biggest reaction. People, told me that they got the chill, they got a goosebump, and that's the moment that I want to preserve and never let that go. So we sort of protected the moment for this sequence. And then I was sitting in the crowd when you guys are watching this, and I heard you guys cheering all the right moments, so that put a big old smile on my face.
Well, the Genji moment in particular, too, that's really the goosebump moment for a lot of people. And that conversation about Genji's outfit that came out of a lot of these discussions.
Yes,
right?
some of you might notice that in the storyboard, we already drew Genji that way. We put a hood on. It's kind of the, he's in secret. He's running around Paris trying to save the guys, trying to make it on time. So I thought maybe it makes sense to give him, an outfit, a sweatshirt and pants, so that he's not like when you first see him. Hopefully it's not like, it's Genji, although everybody probably know that that's Genji as soon as he pulls out the sword. But that sort of kickstarted this whole new outfit, which drives Kevin nuts because he wasn't planning on that.
Yeah, as a producer, when, you start talking about new outfits on assets you already have, that sends a little bit of a different chill down your spine. But, no, we knew that going into this, that Overwatch 2, the characters were going to get a big revamp. But in the early discussions, we weren't really sure whether or not these characters would have, their new costumes in this piece. We thought maybe they don't get that until the game. But, after those initial Genji discussions about, maybe he's been sort of disguising himself and sort of trying to blend in, it really started to make sense that, okay, yeah, maybe the team that did answer the call, Tracer and May, did get their new outfits already. And so that sort of spawned a discussion about, how are we going to do that? Because we didn't have those designs approved. We didn't have the time budgeted in to create those assets before we needed to get started on our production schedule. But luckily, we felt fairly confident that our pipeline and our system we've built over the last 10 episodes was robust enough and flexible enough to be able to absorb changes to those assets mid-production. And to kind of tell you a little bit about how that's done, actually, I'm going to toss it over to Steve.
Yeah, a lot of the cinematics we do it for a WoW expansion, and then we don't ever go back to those characters and leave a lot on the floor. But with Overwatch, we knew we were going to do something continuous. We were going to keep telling more of these stories and follow these characters as they move forward through their lives, and that may mean new costume changes. So because we were going to be doing so much work over so many years, we decided to work a little smarter and protect ourselves by setting some rules. And the first rule involved simply the skeleton within their bodies. And so between animation and rigging, we settled on some special naming and how many joints are going to be in the spine, how the arms and the legs and the neck are going to work. And those are the basic building blocks of a character for rigging and animation. And so we've got a character that if you see, we start laying down that skeleton, and there's Tracer skeleton with all of, not just her main joints, but also the joints for that drive her collar and her goggles and other pieces on her character.
Her hair.
Yeah. The hair. The next thing we need is the model. And so when we get that from the modeling team and drop it in, it's very busy. There's a lot of detail in it. But the most important thing about the model is, who the character is. And so we also put a look on the character, which allows us to read it a little bit better. But the most important thing for the character is the body mesh. And so the body mesh is a sort of like a skin suit. This one fits Tracer, and you can see that it's very simple. But what we can do with that is we can skin it to all of the joints, and each of these little colors kind of shows a relationship to arms, legs, pelvis, spine. And once we have this laid out for a single character and we set up the skinning, then the character can start to move around with the joints. So now the skin at the chin, she can wave her arm. It all works really great. Just to show how powerful this combination of a skeleton and a mesh is, I can take that mesh and I can use it to turn it into May, Brigitte, any of the characters that we've got and reuse that work across all the characters. Now, just for fun, what would happen if we put them all together? New Overwatch character, maybe? I don't know. Probably not. Don't tell Jeff. Okay. So once we've got the skinning and the mesh and the joints, these guys need to be able to control the character. So we put all these control points all over the character, throughout the body, all over the head, like Ben was saying, up in the hair. And that gives us a fully rigged character that animators can animate. The last thing we do to kind of sweeten it is add a control appearance, so the controls aren't buried inside the leg or whatever. There's little handles now they can grab. And in the end, we get a finished Tracer rig. So we can use this to absorb any of the costume changes that come down the line. And it still allows animation to continue to work on the animation. And we keep production moving.
Yeah, and once the rig is, let's be honest, mostly done, it comes to us, and we start setting up the characters. We help set up the face, and we put a bunch of face poses on it to drive everything for the rest of the animators. And what you see here is a ROM test that we throw on all of our characters. ROM stands for range of motion. Primarily, we would do this to help us QC the rig, make sure everything works well. We started doing this actually on Shooting Star, and initially we did this because I wanted the animators to be able to see all the characters making the same expression, but the way each one of those characters made that expression, so the animators would have something to key off of, also to make sure and help QC the rigs just the same. However, we had some unintended positive consequences from this.
Yes, they were positive. They were
positive
consequences.
As we rendered this, the downstream departments got to see all the characters in context. And so it worked really well, and we decided to expand it a bit for 0 hour. And again, this became super powerful for us. We got to see every character, all the hair, all the skin textures, everything together.
You forgot Genji.
No, Genji's there. He's the ninja. He's hiding.
He's hiding.
But again, as everything got put together, it gets everyone in context, down the pipe. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and to recap, this meant, since we were already doing these tests, we really knew, we had the confidence that our rigs had the flexibility to absorb changes. We were also fairly confident that because the game team is working with similar restrictions, that the designs that they would give us would probably respect some of the same issues and problem areas we would have. So, those two things combined, along with the fact that the game team's design philosophy was for the new characters was very much about a clean read. Some of you may not even notice right away in the new cinematic that they had new costumes, and that was very much Arnold Tsang's intent when he was making these designs. He wanted it. He hearkened it to seeing a superhero in their new Mark II armor. You at a glance, you just want to recognize, well, that's Tracer. It's only when you really look at the details that you notice the differences. And so all those things combined meant we went into this thinking, okay, yeah, this is something that's pretty doable. And just to kind of show off those differences, here's sort of a side-by-side of our original Tracer asset and the updated art from Arn. And here's an internal look development turntable that we use to kind of drive the look of the character for the original 1.0 asset and the new Tracer 2.0 asset.
Yeah, I mean, Tracer, once we got the final asset, we realized she was actually going to be easier for us to animate because she got way more streamlined. All the bulky bits got compressed down, and it was going to be a breeze for us to transfer all the animation over, but it caused a little bit of difficulty for, I think, rigging because things got a little bit more complicated.
We can handle it.
And here is a side-by-side of Winston's 1.0 asset and the new art that we've got from Arn. And here are the final assets for Winston up alongside his 1.0 asset.
Yeah, and again, for us, Winston, normally easier, except we had a little bit of worry about his helmet. It got a little bit more bulky, and we had to just be mindful about his cheeks and how much we were emoting and just be able to push things out of the way.
Yeah, and thankfully we got to preserve the faces, though, from the original assets as well. So all the face and hair stayed one-to-one with our 1.0 assets. And here's May's new 2.0 outfit, and she actually received a pretty big overhaul, and when we saw it, we were pretty excited about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, for us, we went great. May got easier, except during production, it got a little odd for us because we thought she was looking off model for some reason, but then we realized we never really saw her neck before. We just had to get used to the new design, and again, just became easier with more range of motion.
Yeah, we were sitting there thinking, oh, great, we got all this extra room now, but then it was sort of counterintuitive because it just made her feel different when we would drop her into the shot. So,
yeah, she got a little bit easier too because we got rid of the big belty belt on her waist, and opening it up really made her easier to rig.
And arguably the biggest change is, kind of our fan favorite Genji. Again, though, his design really did come out of a conversation about that was really more about supporting the story. And interestingly enough, he was also the asset that we developed in-house. A lot of the designs we received from the game team, but Genji was one that we sculpted with our team at Blizzard Animation and actually provided them the high poly asset for this one. And here you can see some of the great sculpt we did for the initial high poly. And here is the side-by-side. So obviously his profile, his overall look, very, very different. And kind of to demonstrate that he is the same character, though, under the hood, why don't you tell us about this, Steve?
You can just see the same skeleton on both skins, and the only difference is the extra joints needed to drive his hood and his shoulder straps around. So, same characters, different skins. We're able to pick those up pretty easily.
And Hunter brought along some footage from the animation play blast to just show you kind of how far we really did take some of these shots with that initial rig.
Yeah, I mean, as the production went, we couldn't wait for the new designs to get finished. We had to get moving, and the first shots and sequences out of layout were a lot of the Genji sequences, and I think Winston, right?
Yeah. We gave you Genji because we knew there was fewer shots. So if there was like any kind of major redo, it would be fewer shots you had to go back into. And then we knew May and Winston's assets were coming to us sooner. And then most of their scenes were in the drop ship, so that was a more controlled environment that was further along.
Yeah, and generally the way we handled it was we would try and take the shots as far as we could until we told the animator to pause, and we'll get back to you when the new asset comes in. And this actually really just goes to show how far we're able to take the assets before we pause and how close the actual final is to where we stopped.
And flexible rigs doesn't just mean being able to swap in assets either. We mean it literally in the case of a lot of our rigs.
Yeah, like yoga flexible. In our rigs, we have things called bendies. In other studios, it's called bend bows or tweaks. It just allows us to really sculpt the character to the frame. It allows us to control a line of action and even to control the motion blur. It's utilizing an animation principle called squash and stretch. And in the Overwatch universe, you want to be able to feel it, but not see it.
Thank you. And just a couple more examples of just us, starting animation with the old assets. Here we've got Winston.
Yeah, and again, Winston really does showcase that. See, the game team has to abide by certain rule sets when they're where they're changing over these assets into the newer ones, and where all the joint positions have to stay the same because they're reusing all their other animations that they've already created. And it just goes to show how much of those limitations actually really, really help us.
Yeah, absolutely. But who wants to talk about all that when we've got giant robots?
Everybody loves a giant robot.
So even with a more straightforward, I say that with the giant Omnic, like he was a straightforward asset, but even a more straightforward asset that we design in-house is rarely a linear process. Here we have an early concept of the Omnic Giant. Very rough, just kind of a block out to get overall shape and feel. And our modeling team would actually take that early concept and make a low poly blockout asset from that. And that would actually, not only feed our previous team so they could get started blocking sequences before we had final designs, but then that would actually go back to the concepting team. So the concepting team would take that geometry and they would start to paint over it to add all sorts of little details and start to figure out a lot of the smaller scale stuff for this very complicated asset. They would then take that, push it even further. They started to incorporate the look of the designs from the null sector Omnics to get into the same color scheme and same type of feel and tech level, and then just add more detail and more detail. And the end result of that is all of that great work that they provide to the modeling team maps one-to-one back onto that initial blockout asset. So nothing has to be interpreted. Nothing is wasted.
Yeah, it's the Giant Omnic was actually the largest character we ever created for a cinematic. It took the combined efforts of 5 different modelers to push this one across the line. All told, it ended up being over 5 million polygons and almost 500 UV domains, which are the sections that the model gets broken up for surfacing to apply textures and surfaces and to get the detail into the asset that we need. As comparison, the Omnic Grunt, the smaller one, is more typical, and it's under 395,000 polys and less than 100 UV domains. So this asset was really, really big.
And Stig, the modeling team also did a lot of articulation exercise on this, correct?
Well, yeah, when we work out how our character moves, it usually happens between rigging and animation, but because of the technical nature of this mech, modeling really just tanked the whole thing, figuring out how every little bit articulates, and then fed us that information. We put it in the rig, and animation was able to key it on. So modeling just went above and beyond on this one.
Yeah, it's like Kinson Yu was the main modeler, and he was also the main modeler on the Squid Omnic in Rising Star. He's really, really talented with that kind of stuff. And then Seung-Jun Song kind of helped out with the left arm and the chest. And he worked really closely with you guys in animation on that, and then tag teamed with Chung Khan to do the damage to the arms and the chest and the hand. And then the 2 animators making the UVs were Chris Jennings and Rakan Kamash, and they took 2 days to break up all the UV domains. So that took a while.
And it wasn't just the back and forth with modeling and rigging. We also waited a lot later in the process for the surfacing team to go in and start working on this asset. We actually waited until we had shot context, which by which I mean we knew exactly what we were going to be seeing of this asset in the shot, and that meant we had to hold off until well after previs was done to start figuring out which sections we really needed to focus on to go in and paint in all of that detail. If we had just turned look dev on this asset from the beginning, they'd probably be still working on it today. But because we were able to make smart decisions about what was actually seen in camera, we could focus on those sections. And for instance, very quickly, we realized pretty early in the previous process that we were never going to see the back of the Omnic.
No, we don't. The only shot that we actually see the back is when it gets frozen over, and it's going to be covering ice. So we actually didn't spend a whole lot of time on the back.
Yeah, and whenever we deliver the previs to animation, we have this process where we take the high-res model and apply it to the previs mesh so that it gets a good blockout in motion for lighting to be able to take things down the pipeline. And so they can work on their lighting scenarios. Modeling can see where they need to really focus attention on the details there. And surfacing can also focus where we see the most and what assets we see the most. And so that way it takes the pressure off for animation to try to get through stuff down the pipe for the other teams, and it allows them to kind of get ahead of things so that we can continue moving the whole project forward.
The animators, thank you.
Yeah, well.
And if that was all over your head, that's the glue I'm talking about. But just another example, too, of sort of waiting to make some of those critical design decisions. Here we have an example of sort of our, the blockout that our previs and animation team are able to give us early on in the process. And so here, when Genji deflects the railgun from the Omnic Giant, those contact points that they work out for the shot then drive where we go and model in the damage. And so that way we're not having to guess up front where this needs to happen prior to getting into that shot work and then basically shoehorning the animators into having to make those locations work.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, our previous department gave us a really solid roadmap, and we knew Ben was happy with most of the positioning, and so we just kind of followed the previs, except I do believe we changed where the shoulder damage was actually
I think maybe during previs we had the entry point a little lower, little frontal, but then we realized Tracer has to jump down from the top to enter the robot to plant her bomb. So eventually we sort of move it as far up as we can, but still made that frontal entry wound still works, right?
Yeah, and so if we had waited until, even if we had kicked this off after previs was complete, we would have wasted that work, and that we would have guessed wrong. So the shot here is just a great example of how far we can get in that process before we start to work out those details. And actually, this shot, interestingly enough, also doubles to serve as how we determined where to slice the hand in the first place. Animation's flight path for Genji and Previs's flight path for Genji was how we figured out exactly where we needed to make that cut. So... And actually, so to take a step back, we also have an early look at, similar to what we showed before, this is the animatic that was approved, that actually we started working on previs and kicking off all the downstream departments. But you'll notice this is not the actual opening to the cinematic you saw today. You want to tell us a little more about that, Ben?
Yeah, like I said, we've been in production for a long, long time. So there's a lot of iteration going through during story process. At one point, because we knew that, you guys haven't seen what happened with Winston and all the Overwatch team member for a long time, and what we got to set up what's happening with Paris. So we had this whole thing talking about why they're there, who's attacking Paris, how many people show up, why aren't the rest of the team there, and why is May still in her Arctic outfit when everyone else is not? So none of that sort of made it into the final product, because when we show the test screening to a lot of the guys at work, they start checking out, or it just feels too long, and so knowing that, we hit the pause button, which made Kevin extremely nervous. And since we're already in previs, that's a big thing. If you guys don't know about production, pausing during previs is kind of bad. And we went back to story, and then we figured out a sort of a new way to introduce our characters and heroes.
But yeah, when Ben mentions pausing, nothing ever really pauses. When we had this initial animatic in progress, before a lot of those conversations happened, we already started designing the assets. We knew we needed the dropship. We started designing that layout with the intention that we were going to spend a lot of time up in the cockpit with Winston and Tracer. And as a result, the dropship interior was fully modeled, and the dropship layout for the seats was something that worked for the sequence as it was boarded. But very early on in the previous process, we started to realize, wait a minute, we would have a hard time fitting a lot of the Overwatch team back in these seats.
May can barely fit in the outfit. She's probably one of the smallest characters.
Yeah, so we actually did sort of reverse course, and we went back, and one of our very talented concept artists, Jung Ha, went in and started designing seats that could work for the Overwatch team right before Overwatch disbanded. And she added all this amazing detail in there, all these personal effects that really put each of the characters' fingerprints on those seats. And so now not only could the seats work for our plus-size characters, but that juxtaposition actually became something we wanted to work in sort of as a joke. And yeah, and it really started to give the whole dropship just kind of a new character and feel, right?
And knowing that we're going back and adding these personal effects on each of the seats sort of gave us an idea of how we're going to sort of open our cinematic. I think we double down on the nostalgic factor. Like, we want to show that Winston is really missing his team, showing that He's going to this mission without a full team. It's ill-prepared. Something bad's about to happen. And knowing that each seat represent a ex-Overwatch character really brought some of that nostalgic feeling into the piece.
Yeah, and this is just an absolutely perfect example, I think, of how being open to that flexibility and and that process, and having a team that's capable of supporting those kind of changes midstream can lead to just such a stronger and more emotionally impactful opening. And if it wasn't for that one little bump in logic during the previous process, we never would have arrived at this decision. So I think that's just kind of a testament to when you embrace that this workflow, it can really work for you. So. But we'd be remiss in getting up here and not talking about one of the biggest endeavors we undertook for this episode, which is the Paris environment. Here we have some absolutely amazing early look dev into what the look of the Paris streets could be from our art director, Anthony Efticardi. And we knew this was going to be a big undertaking. We knew we were seeing Paris from the sky, and we knew we were covering more ground than we've ever covered in a typical episode. But thankfully, we've got a couple of tools that help us sort of prepare for this. And actually, Ben, this location was inspired by a real-world location, right?
Yes, we scouted out. I didn't get to go to Paris for this trip, which I'm very disappointed.
I wanted to go to Paris.
Me too. We should have.
Take me.
Yeah, next time, next show. But we went. I got the next best thing. I went on Google Map and then found Paris. Michael Chu told us that it's gonna this whole thing should happen close to Latin Quarter. And then, so I went on Google Map, and we found this intersection that works really well. It has a huge center portion, and it has multiple streets kind of intersecting each other. That's big enough for a big giant army to come in and stomp around and do his thing. So that's where we end up using that as our location.
Yeah, and also we had the advantage of knowing that there was going to be a Paris map. And so we leverage as many of the assets as we can from the game. So we have a couple examples here of buildings we're able to grab from the game, and the very minor updates that our environments team has to do to bring those in line with the level of detail we see in most of our environments.
And we try not to change a whole lot because you still want to get that association with the game. So if you look at the game on the Paris map, you can pick out the building because they're there.
Yeah, the changes were basically made because we were getting a lot closer up, and they just needed more fidelity for surfacing and to break out windows so we could turn lights on and off and things like that to give it a little bit more personality.
And I believe someone actually wrote a script to turn on lights and turn off lights, right?
Yeah,
it's like a random lights thing where you're putting some random numbers and half of the light turn on in the shot.
Yeah.
And this kind of represents the overall kit of buildings we basically had to populate the city.
Yeah, it was less than 10 buildings that created that entire environment, and so we just kind of mix and match the details that we put onto the buildings, like the storefronts and various other set dressing assets.
Yeah, and so we made these storefronts kind of modular as well, so that way the combination of the building facade and the storefront could be mixed and matched to give the illusion of even more variety, and gave us a lot of flexibility to populate the shots and sort of art direct what we wanted to see in there. And Ben Cunningham is the one who's responsible for a lot of that on a day-to-day basis. So, and actually, Ben, speaking of which, brought an absolutely amazing little piece of media here for us.
Yeah, like Ben said, we started with scouting out in Google Maps. John Tier and Vince Lee are previous people on this one. They found the site, and then they used this open source program called OpenStreetMap. They gave them the geometry that we used for the framework and the basis of our environment. And so we took that, and then we added the game assets, the buildings and kiosks and the various different things that anything we could, just to be able to reuse as much as we could. And then we started adding in things like trees and street lights and street signs and rubble and trash and things that would allow us to make one part of the street look like a war zone, another part of the street city look like it was just abandoned, and the cars and things like that, and with all that kind of randomization to give it the personality that you see in the final piece.
I don't think not everything's random, because I remember we had We had discussions about what color the tree should be. At one point, we had yellow trees, brown trees, green.
Lots of conversations about
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
and at some point we had like these taxis
Oh,
of
yeah.
cars.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I keep seeing this weird looking blue car. Can we change the color? And
Yeah.
then it has to go in and dig out, find that car, populate it throughout everything, pretty much every single shot.
Yep.
And yeah, it's a lot of work, and Ben pretty much handled it all by himself.
I had a little bit of help, but yeah, I did it a lot.
Well, and so here's kind of a, yeah, thank you. Here's kind of a top-down view that just really, if we haven't hit you over the head with it already, just demonstrates that this all really did take place in sort of a one-to-one environment. We picked a set and picked a location and choreographed everything. So it really worked on this sort of three-block, section inspired by a real Paris location. And kind of to demonstrate that point even further, our previous team mocked up this cool demo for us.
Yeah, it's usually when we storyboard, it's shot by shot. So a lot of time when the artist is thinking about a particular shot, he tries to keep, or he or she tried to keep everything in line. But once in a while, we had to cheat. But in this process, in previs, we actually basically block out the entire action in one go, in one giant file, and then every time there's a shot cut, you can see in the back. Every time there's a new shot, the new camera highlighted, and then that's when we cut. So not a lot of cheating going on in this process.
No, it was very much like a practical shoot because we had, for better or for worse, a real live type of set, and so Previs used that like you would filming on location and used the limitations to drive the story, and we didn't have to cheat very much, just basically for composition.
Yeah, it keeps us honest. Also, it's helpful for the downstream department. Animation benefit from that. Also, lighting benefit from that, so they can set up one giant set of lighting and then be able to get us like maybe 75% there, and then the rest of 25% is the grueling 10 weeks of lighting,
Yeah, most of the changes were just adding a tree. Happy little trees everywhere. Tree.
And smoke and fire.
Yeah, smoke and fire.
Right? And
tree, smoke, and fire.
Trash on the floor.
Sounds like a band, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think the interesting thing here, too, is when you look at this, there are some things we've clearly cheated here, especially when you notice the repeat of the laser going down the street. But those are really more of an extension of the editorial process and wanting to stretch out moments and play with time rather than cheating space, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing we actually did cheat it was the trajectory with the bomb, or when the big giant Omnic shoots his cannon, because he's shooting towards down the street, but we have to land it on Winston, but I don't think anybody cared.
Well, laser goes faster than three shots, so you kind of got to space it out a little bit.
Yeah, it's a time cut cheat.
And Ben, what was kind of your favorite moment from this whole process? I mean, we've been on this show together for over 2 years.
Working with the animators.
The favorite process is spending this time with you, Kevin.
Thank you.
And all you guys, of course.
Aww.
Steve, how about you? What was your favorite moment from the show?
Well, first, I just want to give a big thanks to Hung Lee, who isn't up here today, but he tanked most of this work, and I think, again, working with this crew, and thank you guys for being supportive of what we do. We love making these cinematics. We love seeing you guys ask for more. Please keep doing that, and we'll keep making them.
And Hunter, I already know your answer. It's working with me was your favorite part of the show. So Ben, what was your favorite part of the show?
I think Hunter's favorite part of the show was the beginning opening, because he thinks it's the best animation he's ever seen.
It's just because I did
That's
them.
because Hunter animated all the stuff shaking and rattling in the ship in the very beginning.
I used my 20 years of animation experience to shake things.
Well,
Shook.
my favorite part of everything was actually experiencing all of you seeing this for the first time.
Yeah.
It was really, really emotional for me to feel you guys feel it for the first time and react really, really well. And I enjoy it, and all of you allow us to make cartoons for a living, so thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no joke. Sometimes at the end of a process like this, you feel like you've probably seen this 500 times. You start to wonder, are the jokes even funny? Are people even going to like this?
I almost pulled a joke about, is that a monkey out? Because we heard it so many times, it doesn't make any sense to me anymore. The ice to meet you was cringy to me.
Everybody loves a dad
end,
joke.
You know, I lost perspective at the end. But I'm glad you guys liked it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And before we close, though, I always like to share a few stats. So I mentioned before, and Ben mentioned before, this was the biggest undertaking we've ever attempted on an episode, and we are not downplaying that or underselling that at all. This was 13 hero character assets, by which I mean have got the full animation treatment, and over 181 shots, if you include the one that hit the cutting room floor on the last day of the mix.
Yeah, we did everything wrong. We cut a shot, we extended the shot, we changed VO at the very end.
Yeah, all the things you're not supposed to do at the end of the show.
Went wrong, but everything turned out okay.
I mean, I asked Ben to extend a shot when he was actually doing the mix when we were not supposed to do that.
And to get all that done, we had to render over 787,000 frames during the lifetime of the show. And to do that required over 303,000 proc hours on a GPU. And if you were to do that on one machine, start to finish, end to end, it would have taken over 34 and a half years to render the whole show. So yeah, that just kind of a little taste of what it took to get this one out the door, but it was worth every single second of that render time. So I have to apologize because we never have time to do Q&As on these panels. So for those of you here joining us today, we will be spending some time over in the meet and greet section, so hang out afterwards if you'd like to ask some questions. And thank you for joining us. Have an amazing BlizzCon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending Blizzard Animation, the art of setting the scene. Up next, Hearthstone, telling a year-long narrative.